The morning sun cast long shadows across Freedom Plaza in Washington, D.C., where a crowd of protesters had gathered with signs demanding an end to military spending. Among them, voices rose in angry chants about war profiteering and military-industrial complex. But in the corner, sitting quietly on a weathered cardboard sign that read, "Homeless Veteran, Anything Helps," was a man that would soon learn to deserve more respect than any of them could imagine. Thomas Ghost Patterson sat with his back against the cold marble of the memorial wall, his gray beard unkempt and his clothes bearing the stains of too many nights on the street. His eyes, though tired, held a depth that spoke of things seen and done in places most people couldn't pronounce. But to the protesters marching past, he was just another symbol of what they believed was a broken system. Welcome to those who left a trace. Before we dive into this powerful story of hidden sacrifice and ultimate recognition, tell me in the comments, what city in the world are you watching from today? And if you believe that our veterans deserve better than what they sometimes receive, hit that subscribe button. These stories matter now more than ever. The protest had been building for weeks. Social media influencers, college students, and political activists had organized what they called Operation Truth, demanding transparency in military spending and an end to what they perceived as endless wars. Leading the charge was Rebecca Martinez, a 28-year-old law student whose passionate speeches had made her something of a celebrity in activist circles. "Look around you," Rebecca shouted through her megaphone, her voice echoing off the government buildings. "While people sleep on the streets, billions are spent on war machines. While veterans are ignored and forgotten, defense contractors get rich." The irony was lost on her as she gestured toward Thomas, who sat less than 50 feet away, holding a sign that proved her point about forgotten veterans. Though not in the way she imagined. Thomas had been homeless for 3 years, ever since his wife died, and medical bills consumed everything he'd saved during his 30-year military career. The VA had tried to help, but the system was overwhelmed, and Thomas had fallen through the cracks. He didn't complain, didn't blame anyone. He simply endured, the way he'd been trained to do in situations far worse than sleeping on cold concrete. As the morning wore on, the crowd grew larger and angrier. What had started as a peaceful demonstration was beginning to take on the edge of mob mentality. Someone had brought a sound system, and speakers were taking turns delivering increasingly inflammatory speeches about military waste and veteran neglect. "The military creates these broken people and then abandons them," shouted Marcus Thompson, a young activist with a perfectly groomed beard and designer protest clothes. "They turn civilians into killing machines and then dump them on our streets." A few people in the crowd turned to look at Thomas, their expressions mixing pity with disgust. One woman, carrying a sign that read "Peace Not War," actually stepped close to take a photo of him, apparently seeing him as a perfect prop for her social media post about military failure. Thomas noticed the attention but didn't react. He'd learned long ago that survival sometimes meant becoming invisible, even when people were staring right at you. He pulled his worn military surplus jacket tighter around his shoulders and tried to focus on the warmth of the sun on his face. That's when things took a darker turn. "Hey, you!" Marcus called out to Thomas, emboldened by the crowd's energy. "You're a veteran, right? Tell these people what the military did to you." Thomas looked up slowly, his weathered face showing no emotion. "I learned that I was protesting against the wrong thing," Marcus said. "I thought I was fighting against militarism, but I was actually fighting against the people who protect our right to protest." Thomas nodded. "The system failed me, Marcus. But the system is made up of people. When people change, the system changes. You're proof of that." As the ceremony concluded, Thomas stood before the memorial wall where he had spent so many cold nights. The inscription read, "Thomas Ghost Patterson, homeless veteran, presidential advisor, voice for the voiceless." But Thomas knew that the real memorial wasn't carved in stone. It was in the lives that had been changed, the veterans who had been rescued from the streets, the system that had been reformed to honor its promises. Secretary Harrison approached him as the crowd began to disperse. "Any regrets, Ghost?" Thomas looked around at the transformed plaza, at the veterans who had come to honor the memory of those still struggling, at the activists who had learned to protest with purpose rather than anger. No regrets, Thomas said finally. Everything that happened led to this moment. Every night on the streets, every insult, every moment of despair. It all had to happen for me to understand what needed to be changed. And now, Thomas smiled. The first genuine smile he'd worn in years. Now I keep working. There are still 37,000 homeless veterans out there. There's still people who don't understand what service really means. There's still work to be done. As the sun set over Washington, D.C., Thomas walked away from the Memorial Plaza, but he carried with him the knowledge that his story had become something larger than himself. He had become a symbol of redemption, of the possibility of change, of the power of one person to transform a system. The homeless veteran who had been spit on and mocked had become the voice of a generation of forgotten warriors. The man who had been dismissed as a broken soldier had become the architect of a new approach to veteran care. And somewhere in America, another veteran was sleeping on the streets, unaware that Ghost Patterson was working to ensure that their story would have a different ending. The Secretary of Defense had knelt before him in recognition of his service, but Thomas knew that the real victory was in the promise of hope. Hope for every veteran who had been forgotten. Hope for every family member who had watched a loved one struggle. Hope for a nation that was finally learning to honor its promises to those who served. The protest was over, but the revolution had just begun. And Ghost Patterson would make sure that no veteran would ever have to fight that battle alone. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on Freedom Plaza as the protest reached its crescendo. The crowd had swelled to nearly 1,000 people, their chants growing louder and more aggressive with each passing hour. Someone had brought drums, and the rhythmic beating added a tribal intensity to the demonstration. Thomas remained in his spot against a memorial wall, but now he wasn't alone. Colonel Mitchell had stayed beside him, her presence a small island of calm in the growing storm. She made several phone calls, speaking in low, urgent tones to people Thomas couldn't identify. "How long?" she asked, checking her watch. "How long what?" Thomas replied, though he could see the tension in her shoulders. "How long have you been out here? Living like this?" Thomas considered the question. Time had become fluid when you had no schedule, no obligations, no one depending on you. 3 years, maybe 4. Hard to say. And in all that time, no one recognized you? No one from your old unit? "People see what they want to see," Thomas said simply. "They see a homeless veteran. They think broken soldier. They don't see the man who saved their right to protest." Colonel Mitchell's jaw tightened. That's about to change. On the makeshift stage, Marcus Thompson was working the crowd into a frenzy. His speech had devolved into personal attacks on Thomas, using him as a symbol of everything wrong with American foreign policy. "Look at him," Marcus shouted, pointing directly at Thomas. "Sitting there like he deserves our sympathy, like we owe him something. This man is a killer, a murderer, and you want us to thank him for his service?" The crowd roared its agreement, and Thomas felt a familiar coldness settle over him. It was the same detachment he'd felt in combat, the ability to separate his emotions from the chaos around him. He'd need that skill now more than ever. "You know what you did over there," screamed a young man with a mohawk and safety pins through his ears. "You know the blood on your hands. How you sleep at night?" For the first time all day, Thomas stood up. The crowd fell silent, perhaps sensing that something was about to change. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of a man who commanded respect in life and death situations. "You want to know how I sleep at night?" Thomas said, his voice carrying across the plaza. "I sleep knowing that every breath you take is a freedom I help protect. Every word you speak is a right I help preserve. Every chance you have to stand here and call me a murderer is a privilege I fought to defend." The crowd stirred uneasily, but Marcus recovered quickly. "Pretty words from a baby killer. Tell us about the children you murdered. Tell us about the villages you destroyed." Thomas's eyes found Marcus in the crowd, and for a moment, the younger man seemed to shrink under the intensity of that gaze. "You want to know about children?" Thomas said quietly. "I'll tell you about children. Colonel Mitchell grabbed his arm. "Ghosts don't. They don't deserve to know." But Thomas continued, his voice steady and strong. October 15, 2011, a school in Kandahar province. Taliban fighters had taken 200 children hostage. The local government was ready to write them off as collateral damage. But my team, we went in. The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on his every word. 18 hours of operation. No sleep, no food, no backup. We went room by room, floor by floor. Every step could have been our last. Every door could have been booby-trapped. But we didn't stop. You know why? Marcus had gone pale, but he managed to croak. Why? Because those children had the right to live. Because their mothers had the right to hold them again. Because sometimes the only thing standing between innocence and evil is someone willing to risk everything to make the difference. Thomas paused, letting his words sink in. We got them all out. Every single child. All 200 of them. And yes, we had to kill the men who were holding them. Men who were using 8-year-olds as human shields. Men who had bombs strapped to 6-year-old girls. We killed them and we'd do it again. The silence stretched like a taut wire. Someone in the crowd was crying. Marcus looked like he might be sick. But you'll never read about that mission in the papers. Thomas continued. You'll never see it on the news. Because the men who do the hardest jobs don't do them for recognition. They do them because someone has to. Because freedom isn't free and peace isn't natural. Someone has to stand guard so that spoiled children can stand in the sunlight and complain about the darkness they've never seen. Colonel Mitchell was watching the crowd carefully, noting the way some people were backing away, the way others were looking at Thomas with new understanding. But she was also watching the street, waiting for the arrival she'd arranged. You think you know what war is? Thomas said, his voice growing stronger. You think you understand sacrifice, but you've never held a dying friend in your arms. You've never had to choose between your own life and the lives of strangers. You've never had to live with the weight of decisions that others are too weak to make. Marcus tried to recover his earlier bravado. That doesn't justify. Justify? Thomas's voice cracked like a whip, and several people in the crowd actually stepped back. You think I need to justify saving children? You think I need to explain why I chose to protect the innocent instead of letting them die? For the first time since the protest began, Thomas was showing emotion. Real, raw emotion that cut through the crowd's manufactured anger like a blade. I've killed men, Thomas continued. I won't lie about that. But every man I killed was trying to kill someone who couldn't defend themselves. Every trigger I pulled was to save a life, not take one. Every mission I completed was to bring peace, not create war. The crowd was completely silent now. Some people openly crying, others looking ashamed of their earlier behavior. And when I came home, Thomas said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, I found a country that had forgotten what sacrifice means. A country that confuses comfort with strength, noise with conviction. A country that's so safe, so protected, so far from real danger that it can afford to spit on the people who keep it that way. Thomas sat back down, suddenly looking older and more tired than his 62 years. So yes, I sleep at night. I sleep knowing that children are alive because of what I did. I sleep knowing that mothers have their babies because of the choices I made. And I sleep knowing that people like you are free to hate me because of the freedoms I helped preserve. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the drums had stopped. The crowd seemed frozen, unsure how to respond to this unexpected display of dignity and pain. That's when Colonel Mitchell's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and smiled grimly. Right on time, she murmured. In the distance, the sound of helicopters could be heard approaching. Not the traffic choppers that usually flew over D.C., but something bigger, something military. Thomas looked up at the sky, his trained ear recognizing the distinctive sound of military aircraft. Sam, what did you do? What should have been done 3 years ago? She replied. I made some calls, reminded some people about who you really are. The helicopters were closer now, and the crowd was beginning to murmur nervously. These weren't news helicopters or police aircraft. These were military transports, and they were coming in fast. "Ladies and gentlemen," Colonel Mitchell announced, her voice carrying across the plaza, "I'd like you to meet the Real Ghost Patterson, Medal of Honor recipient, Distinguished Service Cross, Silver Star with 3 oak leaf clusters, Bronze Star with V device and 2 oak leaf clusters, Purple Heart with 4 oak leaf clusters. And that's just the beginning." The crowd turned to stare at Thomas, who was shaking his head at Colonel Mitchell. "Sam, don't. This isn't necessary." "The hell it isn't," she replied. "These people need to understand what they're looking at. They need to know that the man they've been spitting on is someone who gave everything for their right to stand here and be ignorant." The helicopters were directly overhead now, and the crowd was backing away as the aircraft prepared to land in the street adjacent to the plaza. Thomas could see the markings on the aircraft. Official military transports, not ceremonial flights. "Who's coming?" he asked. Colonel Mitchell smiled. "Everyone who matters. Everyone who remembers what you did. Everyone who's been looking for you since you disappeared." The first helicopter touched down, and Thomas felt his heart stop. Walking across the plaza, flanked by a security detail, was a man he'd only seen on television and in newspapers. Secretary of Defense James Harrison, a man who'd built his career on understanding the true cost of military service. But Harrison wasn't alone. Behind him came a procession of high-ranking military officials, each one walking with the purposeful stride of someone on a mission. Thomas recognized some of them, generals and admirals whose careers had been built on the foundation of operations that men like Ghost Patterson had made possible. The crowd parted like water, suddenly uncertain about their anger, their protests, their righteous indignation. This wasn't what they'd expected when they'd come to demonstrate against military spending. Secretary Harrison walked directly to Thomas, ignoring the crowd, the cameras, the protest signs scattered on the ground. When he reached the memorial wall, he stopped, looked down at the homeless veteran sitting on a piece of cardboard, and without hesitation, dropped to one knee. "Ghost Patterson," Harrison said, his voice carrying across the now silent plaza. "On behalf of a grateful nation, I'm here to take you home." The silence in Freedom Plaza was absolute. 1,000 protesters stood frozen, their signs forgotten, their chants died on their lips. The Secretary of Defense of the United States of America was kneeling before a homeless veteran, and the implications of that image were beginning to sink in. Thomas stared at Secretary Harrison, unable to process what was happening. "Sir, you don't need to." "Yes, I do," Harrison interrupted, his voice firm but respectful. "I absolutely do, because this nation has failed you, and that failure starts with leaders like me who allowed a hero to fall through the cracks." Behind Harrison, the assembled military officials stood at attention. There were more arriving every moment. Generals with chests full of ribbons, admirals whose careers spanned decades, and officials whose names Thomas recognized from news reports about national security. "Ghost Patterson," Harrison continued, still kneeling, "you're directly responsible for saving over 400 American lives in combat. You prevented 3 separate terrorist attacks on American soil. You successfully completed 47 classified missions that will never be publicly acknowledged. And somewhere along the way, we forgot to take care of you." The crowd was beginning to murmur, but it was different now. The anger had been replaced by confusion, embarrassment, and for many, a growing sense of shame. Thomas tried to stand, but Harrison held up a hand. "Please, let me finish. You disappeared from our radar 3 years ago. The VA thought you were dead. Your old unit thought you'd moved overseas. No one knew you were here, living like this, while bureaucrats like me gave speeches about supporting our veterans." Colonel Mitchell stepped forward, her voice carrying across the plaza. "Ladies and gentlemen, let me tell you who you've been protesting against. Ghost Patterson isn't just a decorated soldier. He's a man who single-handedly prevented the bombing of a school in Afghanistan. He's a man who walked into a Taliban stronghold alone to negotiate the release of American hostages. He's a man who gave 30 years of his life to protecting people who would never know his name. Marcus Thompson, who had been leading the anti-military chants just minutes earlier, looked like he might collapse. His face was white, his hands shaking. I didn't know." "No, you didn't know," Harrison said, finally standing and turning to address the crowd. "But you didn't ask, either." You saw a homeless veteran and assumed he was a victim of the military system. You saw a man who'd given everything for his country and decided he was a symbol of American failure. The Secretary of Defense gestured to the assembled officials behind him. These men and women have been searching for Ghost Patterson for 3 years. Not because he was in trouble, but because he was supposed to receive the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Because he was supposed to be honored at the White House. Because he was supposed to be recognized as the hero he is. Thomas felt overwhelmed by the attention, by the explanations, by the sudden reversal of his circumstances. "Sir, I don't need any of that. I just need a home," Harrison finished. "Medical care, the respect you earned, the life you deserve after giving everything to your country." The crowd was beginning to break up. People drifting away in small groups, their conversations hushed and subdued. Some were crying. Others looked angry, but not at Thomas, at themselves, at their assumptions, at the system that had allowed this to happen. Rebecca Martinez, who had been filming the entire encounter, slowly lowered her phone. Her earlier smugness had been replaced by something that looked like genuine remorse. She approached Thomas hesitantly, her voice barely audible. I'm sorry. I didn't know who you were. You thought I was a broken soldier," Thomas said quietly. "You weren't entirely wrong. I am broken, but not in the way you imagined." Rebecca's eyes filled with tears. "How do I fix this? How do I make this right?" Thomas looked at her for a long moment, then at the crowd that was still watching from a distance. "You tell the truth. You tell people that military service isn't about politics or oil companies or corporate profits. It's about people willing to stand between evil and innocence. It's about people who choose to carry the weight so others don't have to." Secretary Harrison had been listening to the exchange, and he stepped forward. "Miss Martinez, isn't it? You have quite a following on social media." Rebecca nodded nervously. "Yes, sir." "Then you have an opportunity to educate people about what real military service looks like. You have a chance to show them that the men and women who serve this country deserve better than what happened here today." As the crowd continued to disperse, more military personnel were arriving. Thomas recognized some of them. Men and women he'd served with, commanders who relied on his expertise, medics who'd patched him up after missions. They came up to him one by one, each offering their respects, their apologies, their promises to ensure this never happened again. "Ghost," said a voice Thomas hadn't heard in 10 years. He turned to see Colonel Marcus Webb, his former commanding officer, now wearing the stars of general. "Jesus, man, we've been looking everywhere for you." "I wasn't hiding," Thomas replied. "I was just lost." "Well, you're found now," General Webb said firmly. "And you're coming home." The medical team that had arrived with the military officials began examining Thomas, checking his health, assessing his condition. They were gentle but thorough, treating him with the respect due to a war hero rather than a homeless vagrant. Malnutrition, one of the medics reported to Secretary Harrison. Some signs of exposure, but nothing life-threatening. "He's tougher than he looks." "He always was," Harrison replied. "Ghost Patterson has survived things that would have killed lesser men. I'm not surprised he survived this too." As the afternoon wore on, the transformation in Freedom Plaza was complete. Where there had been angry protesters, there were now respectful conversations about military service and veteran support. Where there had been anti-military chants, there were now discussions about the real cost of freedom. Thomas found himself at the center of it all, overwhelmed by the attention, but grateful for the recognition. Not for himself, but for all the men and women who'd served alongside him, who'd made the same sacrifices, who'd carried the same burdens. "There's something else," Secretary Harrison said, pulling Thomas aside. "The president wants to meet with you. He wants to personally apologize for what happened here today, and he wants to discuss your future." Thomas shook his head. "I don't need to meet the president. I just need to get back on my feet." "You will," Harrison promised. "But first, you need to understand something. Your story is going to change how people think about military service. Your experience here today is going to open eyes and change minds." That's not a burden, it's an opportunity. As the sun began to set over Washington, D.C., Thomas found himself surrounded by people who understood what he'd been through, who recognized his sacrifice, who were committed to ensuring he never fell through the cracks again. The protest signs lay scattered on the ground, their messages about military waste and veteran neglect now seeming hollow and misguided. The real story wasn't about military spending or political agendas. It was about people like Ghost Patterson, who'd given everything for their country and asked for nothing in return. Colonel Mitchell approached Thomas as the military officials began preparing to leave. "How are you feeling?" Thomas looked around at the scene. The respectful crowds, the military personnel who'd come honor him, the media that was now telling the story with dignity, rather than sensationalism. "I feel like I'm waking up from a long dream," he said. "Not a good dream, but not a nightmare either. Just empty." "That's about to change," Mitchell promised. "You're going to have more support than you know what to do with. More opportunities than you could imagine. The question is, what do you want to do with them?" Thomas considered the question as he watched the last of the protesters leaving the plaza. Some were still crying. Others were having animated conversations about what they'd witnessed. All of them seemed changed by the experience. "I want to make sure this never happens again," Thomas said finally. "I want to make sure that no veteran falls through the cracks the way I did. I want to make sure that people understand what military service really means." Secretary Harrison overheard the conversation and smiled. "I think we can arrange that. The president is going to offer you a position, special advisor on veteran affairs. You'll be working directly with the administration to improve veteran services and change public perception of military service." Thomas felt a spark of something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope. "I accept." As the military convoy prepared to leave Freedom Plaza, Thomas took one last look at the memorial wall where he'd spent so many nights. The cardboard sign that had been his bed was still there, a reminder of how far he'd fallen and how far he'd risen in a single day. "Ready to go home, Ghost?" General Webb asked. Thomas nodded, but as he walked toward the waiting vehicles, he realized that home wasn't a place anymore. Home was purpose. Home was respect. Home was the opportunity to serve his country once again, not as a soldier in the shadows, but as a voice for those who couldn't speak for themselves. The Secretary of Defense had knelt before him, but Thomas knew that the real victory wasn't in the gesture of respect. It was in the promise of redemption, the chance to turn his suffering into service, his pain into purpose. As the convoy pulled away from Freedom Plaza, Thomas looked back one last time at the site of his transformation. Tomorrow, the protesters would be gone. The media would move on to other stories. But the memory of what happened here would linger, a reminder that heroes don't always wear uniforms, and that sometimes the most powerful protests are the ones that change hearts rather than minds. The homeless veteran was gone, but Ghost Patterson had returned. And this time, he would make sure that no one would ever forget what real service looked like. 6 months later, Thomas Ghost Patterson stood before the Senate Armed Services Committee, his testimony about veteran services making headlines across the nation. The transformation from homeless veteran to presidential advisor had been remarkable, but the journey was far from over. The committee chamber was packed with senators, military officials, and media representatives. Thomas wore a crisp suit that fit him perfectly, his hair neatly trimmed, his bearing once again reflecting the dignity of a career military officer. But the most striking change was in his eyes. The hollow look of despair had been replaced by a fierce determination to make a difference. "Mr. Patterson," Senator Patricia Williams began, "in your 6 months as special advisor on veteran affairs, what have you learned about the scope of veteran homelessness in America?" Thomas leaned forward, his voice clear and strong. "Senator, I've learned that my experience was not unique. There are currently over 37,000 homeless veterans in America. That's 37,000 men and women who served their country and are now sleeping on the streets. But more importantly, I've learned that this problem is entirely preventable." He paused, letting his words sink in. Every homeless veteran represents a failure of our system, not a failure of the individual, but a failure of our institutions to honor the promises we made to those who served. The hearing room was silent, hanging on his every word. Thomas had become a powerful speaker, his personal experience lending weight to his policy recommendations. The Veteran Restoration Act that I propose addresses 3 critical areas, Thomas continued. First, mandatory follow-up for every veteran transitioning out of service. No one falls through the cracks because no one is allowed to disappear. Second, comprehensive mental health services that treat the whole person, not just the symptoms. And third, immediate emergency housing for any veteran who needs it. No questions asked, no bureaucratic delays. Senator Robert Hayes, a conservative Republican who had initially been skeptical of Thomas's proposals, leaned forward. Mr. Patterson, the cost of your recommendations would be substantial. How do we justify that expense to taxpayers? Thomas's smile was sharp. Senator, let me put this in perspective. The total cost of my proposal is less than what we spend on a single fighter jet. We're talking about 37,000 people who've already paid the price for our freedom. The question isn't whether we can afford to help them. The question is whether we can afford not to. The impact of Thomas's testimony was immediate. Within hours, clips of his appearance were trending on social media, shared by millions of Americans who have been moved by his story and his continued advocacy. Rebecca Martinez, who had become one of his strongest supporters, posted a video that went viral within minutes. 6 months ago, I was part of a crowd that spit on this man. Today, he's fighting for every veteran who's been forgotten by our system. If you want to know what real courage looks like, watch this testimony. The video showed Thomas fielding hostile questions from skeptical senators, his calm demeanor and factual responses gradually winning over even his harshest critics. By the end of the hearing, several senators who had entered the chamber opposed his proposals were asking how quickly they could be implemented. But Thomas's work wasn't limited to congressional hearings. He had spent the past 6 months traveling the country, visiting veteran homeless shelters, speaking at military bases, and meeting with the men and women who had shared his experience of falling through cracks. In Los Angeles, he met Maria Santos, a former Army medic who had been living in her car for 2 years. I served 3 tours in Iraq, she told him. I save lives every day. But when I came home, I couldn't save my own marriage, my own home, my own life. Thomas listened to her story, recognizing the pain and confusion that had once consumed his own life. Maria, you're not broken, you're not forgotten, and you're not alone. Through his new position, Thomas was able to connect Maria with immediate housing assistance, job training, and mental health services. Within 3 months, she had her own apartment and was working as a paramedic. Her story became one of hundreds of success stories that Thomas could point to as evidence that his approach was working. In Chicago, he met James Wright, a former Marine who had been struggling with PTSD and addiction. I thought I was worthless, James told him. I thought I was a burden on society, just like those protesters said you were. Thomas spent hours talking with James, sharing his own struggles with depression and despair. The difference between a hero and a victim isn't what happens to you, Thomas told him. It's what you do with what happens to you. James entered a treatment program that Thomas helped design, one that focused on purpose and service rather than just recovery. 6 months later, he was working as a counselor for other veterans, using his experience to help others find their way back from the darkness. The success stories were mounting, but Thomas knew that the real measure of his impact would be in the systemic changes he could implement. The Veteran Restoration Act was making its way through Congress, with bipartisan support that had surprised even Thomas's allies. During a private meeting with President Katherine Morrison, Thomas laid out his vision for veteran care in America. Madam President, we have an opportunity to create a system that doesn't just treat veterans as problems to be solved, but as assets to be valued. Every veteran who falls through the cracks represents lost potential, lost experience, lost leadership. President Morrison, herself a former Army officer, understood the implications. Ghost, your proposals are ambitious, but they're also necessary. The American people have seen what happens when we fail our veterans. They've seen your story and they're demanding change. The president's support gave Thomas's initiatives the momentum they needed. The Veteran Restoration Act passed both houses of Congress with overwhelming majorities, and the president signed it into law in a ceremony attended by hundreds of veterans, including many who had been homeless but were now rebuilding their lives. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came when Thomas returned to Freedom Plaza, 1 year after his confrontation with the protesters. The plaza had been transformed into a memorial garden for homeless veterans, with a simple inscription, in honor of those who served and suffered in silence. A crowd had gathered for the dedication ceremony, including many of the same people who had protested there a year earlier. Marcus Thompson, the young activist who had led the anti-military chants, approached Thomas nervously. "Mr. Patterson, I know this doesn't change what I did, but I wanted you to know that I've been volunteering at the Veterans Center downtown. I've been trying to understand what I was protesting against." Thomas studied the young man's face, seeing genuine remorse and growth. "Marcus, the best apology is change behavior. If you're helping veterans now, then you've learned something valuable.